Guys, I just wanted to make this video on geofencing warrants, and this is by no means all the information that law enforcement can get from like cell tower dumps and stuff. This is specifically in regards to Google's geofencing data that law enforcement often gets to help them find out who was in a particular area. And so this is only going to be people that actually have Google accounts, have their phone on them, actually have their location enabled.
Police were using what's called a geofence warrant. Police place a virtual perimeter around a crime scene and determine a window of time during which they believe the crime occurred. They then ask a judge to sign a warrant like this one, asking Google for cell phone location data that fits those parameters. That nets detectives a list of phone numbers and potential suspects.
It's essentially a broad sweeping general warrant of the judge says, okay, law enforcement, you can get anyone and everyone that is in any proximity to the crime scene.
So the rest of this video is a really rough edit because I just don't really have time to edit it like cleaner, but it has very good information in it. So if you want to watch it, here it is.
Unlike cell site location information, because of the depth of the data that we have, because your device is using many different sources to get this information, we now have much more granular information about the locations. So we're seeing GPS is used, you have Wi-Fi being used, as well as the cellular network, but in your IP addresses. So what you do across these Google applications is being aggregated within your account and also being captured in your location history. And so Wi-Fi can be used to determine your location by understanding how far away you are from certain Wi-Fi access. You're in your office and you go to connect to the internet, you see the list of internet connections that are available. You haven't connected to any of those, but your phone can hear the signals coming from those different networks. Just like based on Google knowing where these access points are, they now know where you are. And this essentially happens through, again, our devices surveying. And so this taking in these signal strength values and understanding where you are, that's the known location. And now using that against unknown locations, i.e. your devices as you use them, to get an understanding about where that device is. So this is how they build out this network or this database to be able to take measurements from your device and understand where you are.
This is what a geofence warrant looks like. You're going to see some coordinates on there, a time frame, and maybe a map showing the geofence. And it typically follows a three-step process.
So we will start by drawing the fence. We want to capture the location that is in question. And so how that fence is drawn can depend on what is actually captured. So placing this close to busy streets, near residences, anything like that can aid in gathering more information. So as we start to expand this into areas where more and more people are, while it does not affect how many people are searched, it will often result in how many people's data is actually turned over. Once we get this step one data, we can start to position people within the geofence and see where these users were when they entered the fence, when they left. You can see a lot about just that specific area. So once that occurs, we've captured all of those people. And that is the pool in which we are going to start seeing data across the following steps. So in step one, here we have 6 different users, and we're going to start to learn more about them. But during this time, we already know when they entered, when they exited. We know about how long they were there. And then other things that we don't really know is sometimes we don't know how long they were there. We've had many cases where someone's data will show up with one data point within the geofence. So in step 2, this is where we really begin to learn about the user. So you often see this referred to as contextual data. It provides context to the users that have been captured. You will remove the time frame, or often expand the time frame, and then remove the geofence. So what you end up seeing is someone move from outside of the fence into the fence and then leave. This has provided a lot of information about who these people are, because we see them leave places like their homes, places of business, and anything else that you can think of as far as where someone would, just be traveling. Sometimes where they work, where they live, the places of worship, and also where they pick up and drop their children. That was actually once that happens and they start to see these movements, another choice is made, and provide Google with the final set of users that they want to move to step 3. So step 3 is once we start to identify the actual user. And when I say identify, that means this is where they are de-anonymized. What we're going to be provided is their subscriber, Google subscriber information. This provides email addresses, this provides phone numbers, this provides IP addresses. What it also provides is a lot of information that can now be gathered through further search warrants, call detail records, IP logs, email addresses, and home addresses will also be contained in here. So as you see, this one geofence warrant went from not knowing anyone to learning about someone's day-to-day activities, to now learning their name, email address, phone number, and everything else, to now spawning off into further legal process to get more information about that person. We have found often in this step, after seeing all this information, innocent people are still being captured within that information that have, really, once you look at the data, no reason to make it to step 3. So it's very interesting to see the data as it progresses.
But step one is identifying devices inside the geofence that have location history enabled. Step two is looking at those devices. And so they look at the data coming in at step one. They say, these people are interesting, or maybe everyone's interesting. Let's figure out where they were the 2 hours before and the 2 hours after. And they get all of that data. And all of that is supposedly anonymous. And then in step three, the finalists get their subscriber information revealed. So you get the actual Gmail address and the name that was signed up. It's important to recognize that this is not precise information. When you get this data, it comes with something called a display radius. And that's basically Google's way of expressing uncertainty in your location. The data, location history data, is derived from GPS and Wi-Fi and cell and Bluetooth, but it is not actually any of those things. It is Google's guess, their best estimate of where you are based on all of these different inputs. And so what they do is they create something called display radius. You'll recognize that as the light blue circle around the blue GPS dot. This is important because we're basing people's location off of often that center point, but that is not accurate. You can be anywhere within that blue circle. You can be outside of that blue circle, but this is the display radius. And so this is actually what the location history data looks like. And if you'll note on the right-hand side, you will see that display radius value. So it's expressed in meters, and it always changes. It's not the same. It's not always 100 meters. It's not always 50 meters. Sometimes it can be 1,000 meters or 2,000 meters, depending on the type of data that your phone is pulling down and sending to Google at any given time. Location history was not designed to solve crimes. It was designed to sell advertisements. And Google freely admits this. So they actually say that they only aim to be about 68% accurate. So there's a 68% chance at any given moment that your phone is actually within that blue circle. Forget about the blue dot. That means there's a 32% chance that it's nowhere inside that circle at all. This is, I guess, familiar if your GPS puts you in the middle of a lake instead of the road next to the lake. So how do we figure out who's inside the circle? How do we count here? You might be at the center of that circle. You might be at that little blue dot, but you might be somewhere outside of that geofence. So it means that you're going to get some false positives. This is very, very likely, right? You're going to get people who are sucked into that geofence that weren't actually there. And there are a couple ways to deal with that. You can count all of those people, even if they're outside of the actual geofence. You can look and see. So you're going to create false positives when you count devices that have display radiuses that extend outside of that geofence. False positive here means that somebody is being identified as within that geofence, although they were never there. And before we talk about counting, I want to actually have Spencer explain a little bit about how we get to a false positive.
Yeah, so when we start to see the data, especially in step two, that's where we begin to see these false positives occur. And in cases, what we've seen is oftentimes when I see one data point in step one, it starts to pique my interest in whether or not this person actually entered the geofence or not. So then what we start to see is once we get to step two, as we see those people travel, path of travel, and then what you will see is you will see it deviate over into the geofence. What we find is often, especially in Chatri, is we found that one of the specific locations that was right along the roadway encompassed in the geofence was something, it was almost like a magnet pulling people in. And the reason that was is because it was a mega church. And that church has a lot of people that funnel through the front door of that place a few times a week. And their phones continually report that same geolocation and that same Wi-Fi access point that's being used over and over again. And what happens is it starts to see, when it sees phones coming by, it often thinks, oh, well, they must be here at church as well, and reports them inside. So we would see people travel down the street, coming by the church, and then all of a sudden their device would jump inside and then jump right back outside and continue down that path. And we could see these people, again, because we had their location history for an hour and a half at this point. We could see them travel from, I believe one traveled from a hospital, came down, turned down some streets, passed by, jumped in the fence, jumped out of the fence, and went home. And so we were able to, again, identify that person, something that we would never be able to do with call detail records or any other data, because we could see the precise places that they went. We could see the home that they went to. So you can actually, from the path, start to find where you start to see your false positives, these people being drawn into the fence. So now if we know that the boundaries of that fence aren't really boundaries and people can be pulled in, that now makes that effective range of the geofence much larger than what's being provided to that magistrate.
And do we want to err on the side of capturing as many people in that geofence as possible, even though it might generate false positives? Or do we want to try and count in a way that minimizes the likelihood of those false positives and reduces the number of people caught up in that geofence? So if we assume this is our geofence, let's look at the options. This is option one. We could say return information about every device whose display radius touches that geofence, intersects with it. You might do this if you want to be really sure that you got everybody in the area. But it is also going to generate the highest number of false positives and pull in the largest number of people into that geofence. You might do it this way. This is how they did it in Chaudhry, by counting only the devices whose center point is inside of that geofence, regardless of how big the display radius may be. That's sort of a middle ground. You're still going to get false positives, but the number of people returned in step one might be lower. And then, if you want to be sure that you are not getting false positives, or at least as sure as you could be, given that 32% chance you're not in that circle at all, but you might say, okay, only return devices whose entire display radius is inside of that geofence. That's going to shrink the number of people that are captured in step one and reduce the number of false positives. Warrants sometimes specify how to count, and sometimes they don't. They just leave it up to Google and the government to decide. And this is a big issue, right? How many people are you going to get data about? Are you going to get information about people who are likely outside of that geofence? Should that decision be up to the cops? Get those returns in step one, and they say, well, these are the devices that interest me. I think they're the most relevant. So why don't you give me an additional 3 or 4 hours of location data on all these people? And sometimes they don't even attempt to narrow it down at all. They just say, you know what? I want to see the contextual data. I want to see the step 2 data on everybody. And it's going to be up to law enforcement and Google to hash that out. The judge is not involved at this point. And the same goes for step 3. Once you get that contextual data and you might have a good idea of who you want to reveal, get subscriber information about, that's up to law enforcement and Google once again. You don't often, it's everyone, but the government freely admits that they can subpoena the actual subscriber information with just the step 1 data. So really, it's window dressing, and the whole ball game is step 1. How do you even count who's inside the geofence? Google specifies. Google decides that, well, we're going to search the Sensor Vault database. We're going to search location history, but we're not going to search these other databases of location data, web and app activity. So you're generating location information when you use the web and you run searches. They're not going to search Google Location Accuracy, which is that database that allows them to figure out where you are based on Wi-Fi. Instead, they're going to search the Sensor Vault and location history only. That may be a smaller number, but it is still Google and the government deciding who gets searched, not a judge. And this is also an issue when it comes to how to count. And so remember this display radius we were talking about earlier, this idea that there's only a 68% chance that you're in there, there's a 32% chance you're out of it. And also, you are no more likely to be at the center of that circle than you are somewhere off to the side, right? Google just plops a dot right in the middle of that circle as a visual aid. It doesn't mean anything. You are no more likely to be at the center of that circle than somewhere else, or perhaps even outside of it.
In the affidavit quoted in this last slide, I'll go back. If we assume that, the affiant stated that 56% of adults in the United States have a smartphone. Add a few more facts in. If we assume that 40.5% of smartphone users have an Android device that's associated with a Google account, and then we know that a third of Google users have location history enabled, do all that math, and it's 7.5%, which is hardly a fair probability that the search of numerous tens of millions, or 592 million users, is going to yield a viable suspect.
Police have a new crime-fighting tool called a geofence warrant, information about who may have been near a scene of a crime that can help crack a difficult case.
As the other issue the court identified, that law enforcement did not need to provide probable cause that the individual user was relevant to the case. In other words, once they were swept up in the geofence warrant, there was no requirement that there had to be any probable cause that the individual was involved before law enforcement could collect data about them.
But in other cases, geofencing has put dangerous people behind bars.
Tell me what's going on. You said you were bleeding? Oh.
That's the voice of Mitchell Jones, stabbed in his home in Cobb County, Georgia. He died shortly after making this 911 call.
Where are you at in the house? Help! The police are here.
But his last words gave police important clues, an exact time and place for the geofence warrant. One of the 5 cell phone numbers Google provided belonged to Dante Holmes. County prosecutor Jesse Evans tells the I-Team after police confronted Holmes with the cell phone evidence, he confessed to Jones' murder. If it hadn't been for the geofence warrant, do you think that this criminal would be behind bars today?
It's hard to say. I mean, absent him making statements to somebody or another way revealing that he was involved in this case, I'm not sure that we would have been successful in identifying him but for the use of this new technology and this new geofence search warrant.
This
So as we go through looking at this data, we could see people as they traveled from places of business to their homes. One of the characters that we had, she took her child to a particular high school, went to a particular store. We saw where they traveled from home. You start to learn when they took their children to school from their home. All of these steps, and so using just commonly available, GIS and tax records, we started to identify people. We started to find their Facebook records and gather all this information. And even though law enforcement sat in the room and said this data is anonymous, I sat up there and told them who some of these people were that they had collected data on. Some of these people even made it to step 3, even though we saw all of the kind of the issues that we've highlighted here. I believe it was Mrs. Yellow made it from her home to drop off her child, all of these things, drove past the geofence, was falsely pulled into the geofence as a false positive, and her data was still captured in step 3, where we saw her Gmail address and everything else that also lined up with her Facebook account and anything else that we had found. And so we did all this even prior to getting that sort of information. So we knew all of the data about these people, just like they could learn about them as well.
Question, maybe.
Only
it's a good question. Okay.
So the question was, have we ever seen this used to develop exculpatory evidence? Mike's saying no. And one thing that's important to remember is because we do not have the warrant power and because Google requires a warrant to do the geofence, even if we thought that we could get that, it would not be available as a tool to defense attorneys.
I mean, certainly I have seen cases where the government has decided not to give us the information other than our clients, saying that none of it is relevant and so we can't see it, which means we can't figure out how many people got caught up in that geofence and we can't make our arguments. But the argument in response there is that everything is Brady, right? If you're saying that all these other places, all these other devices were here, but we're not telling you about them, then you make a Brady argument and you get that information. All right.
Think about what probable cause means in this context. We, the cops, have evidence to believe that that the suspect is a Google user and has location history enabled, because that's what you would need in order to establish probable cause. So when we're seeing geofence warrants, what we're seeing in cases, as Mike mentioned, the cases where the police do not have a suspect. And in those cases, the cops are not going to know if the suspect is a Google user or if the suspect has activated location history. And since they have no actual probable cause, all they can offer are some generalizations about the popularity of smartphones and Google. So these are the generalizations that could be recited in any case. As we know, the Fourth Amendment requires that the police show some nexus between the crime and the data to be searched and seized, because without that, there's no probable cause to search anyone's location data, let alone everyone's location data. And even if we accepted the government's generalizations to substitute probable cause, which nobody should be doing, simple math reveals what a weak argument that is.
Geofence warrants are also painfully lacking in particularity at every step along this process. All 3 steps.